This is the first part of the Salzmann Lecture that I gave to the virtual AAO meeting in 2020. The lecture is called Orthodontic Uncertainty, Research, Core Outcomes and Snake Oil. And it was a great honour for me to give this lecture, even if it was only virtual. So, the structure of the lecture that I'm going to talk about today. First of all, we're going to talk about clinical uncertainty. Then we're going to discuss outcome measures. Then we're going to move on to snake oil and the effect of key opinion leaders or clinical salespeople. And then finally, we're going to look at solutions to any problems that I might have identified. So let's start first of all with considering uncertainty. Uncertainty pervades all our lives. For example, we don't know what's going to happen in the next month, the next day, or in fact in the next hour. And we learn to live with uncertainty. Uncertainty, though, is also present in all our clinical decisions. We can never be 100% certain that we are taking the correct decision. In fact, a clinician that is 100% certain probably is not a very good clinician, because they could be a simple cookbook clinician. So we have to accept that there is uncertainty in most of our clinical decisions. However, it is good to minimise the amount of that uncertainty, and of course that can be reduced by research, and that's why we carry out research. The other side of the coin, though, is that the uncertainty can be increased by claims based on low evidence, by case report, unreasonable claims made by people, and unreasonable claims made on social media. That all increases our level of uncertainty about our treatment. And then we also have to consider how much more research is needed to reduce the uncertainty. We'll never eliminate it, but there must be a point where we can say we know enough about this condition and we don't need to carry out any further research into this area. And the reason we want to diminish the uncertainty in our decisions is that we want to practice evidence-based healthcare, and that is healthcare that should give us the maximum benefit for our patients. It's not as simple as though saying we're just going to practice evidence-based healthcare, because we have to consider our levels of evidence that we need to inform our clinical decisions. And I'm just going to go through the pyramid of clinical evidence. I know that people have done this many times before, but it's worthwhile revisiting some of these concepts. So first of all, the lowest level of evidence is a case report, and this really is where someone has done a particularly good treatment, something they're pleased with, and they want to tell everybody about it by the form of a case report. The next level up is a case series, which is a series of case reports put together, and essentially it means that the treatment or intervention that they've done has worked several times quite well. It isn't enough to change practice, but perhaps it's enough for us to start thinking about a treatment as being useful. And then we have case control, which is the standard retrospective study that we know so well in orthodontics, where really we gather cases from our study model store and our record store and analyse them. In effect, what we do is we think of a question to research after we've got the records, which is the wrong way around of doing this. And because of the highly selective methods that we use to collect our cases for a case control series, these studies are subject to considerable levels of selection bias. However, they're not completely useless. We can use them to generate sample sizes and questions for other studies. The next level, of course, is the prospective cohort, where patients are entered into a study and they're followed all the way through their treatment until it completes or they drop out. These are more valuable than case control because they don't necessarily contain so much bias. Nevertheless, the evidence isn't as strong as you would get from a randomised controlled trial, in which patients are randomly allocated to one or more interventions. These really are designed to take into account confounding variables, but also to minimise bias. It's important to mention that a trial doesn't eliminate bias, it simply minimises the bias. And then finally we have the systematic review, where investigators put together several clinical trials increase the amount of data and the power that they've got, and that leads to studies that have a stronger conclusion. However, the only good systematic reviews, and the ones we should be considering in orthodontics at the moment, are those that only contain trials. If they're containing case control and case series, then of course they're providing us with a lower level of evidence than we really would want. Because for us to practice evidence-based care, we need to consider three main areas. The first of those is our clinical experience. We all lean heavily on clinical experience, and certainly there's many areas of orthodontics where perhaps our only evidence is clinical experience. However, it shouldn't be our sole source of evidence in providing care, because we have to factor in the findings from clinical research. And it's absolutely crucial for us to realise that when we have clinical research, it really should take greater priority over the evidence that we're getting from clinical experience. It's of greater power, and we cannot simply ignore the clinical research if it doesn't agree with our clinical experience. So these two areas sort of combine together. And the third area that's important is patient opinion. And really what we need to be doing is informing the patients of our clinical experience, the clinical research that goes along with that, and having them take decisions on their treatment if we are to practice true evidence-based care. So in theory, the evidence-based care system should and does work quite well. However, people have suggested to me that we're not dealing with life and death. We're not as serious as medicine and surgery. Do we need to be practicing evidence-based care? I would say and feel very strongly that we do. First of all, orthodontics is important. Many of our patients are concerned about their teeth. You think of the children that don't go to school or are getting teased very badly, those that are teased on social media. They want to conform to a norm that our society sets about dental appearance. So orthodontics is a vital part of adolescent healthcare. And because of that, we need to be practicing to the best of our ability, and the only way we can really do that is by practicing evidence-based care. So I thought I'd take a little bit of a side swipe here to say, well, what do we really know about orthodontics? And these are just a few of the areas that I think we have reasonable levels of evidence to allow us to provide care. First of all, it's fairly straightforward now after several years of research that no method of speeding up orthodontic treatment really works or has an effect. And we can think of things such as vibratory devices, potions, pills, magic lights and everything like that. There is a lack of evidence that this actually speeds up orthodontic treatment. The bracket and the wire don't seem to matter. There are multiple studies now that show us that the bracket design, self-ligation, passive self-ligating, standard edgewise, straight wire doesn't really influence the success or failure of our treatment, and neither do the wires. And I'll come to greater explanatory variables later. It's fairly easy to get the front 6 teeth straight. We just need to put the wire in. It's what we need to do to actually improve the occlusion, get it to what we perceive to be our ideal. That takes time and skill. We know temporary anchorage devices increase anchorage by about 2 millimeters, and certainly we're seeing a lot of very good treatment being produced and a lot of good research into the value of temporary anchorage devices, which seem to have been a great innovation for orthodontics. We know now that we can't change skeletal growth. We'd like to, but we can't change it to a meaningful degree. Most of our appliances that are supposed to modify growth only change cephalometric measurements by 1 or 2 degrees or a millimetre. These aren't clinically significant, so we can conclude that we can't change skeletal growth. Extraction of teeth is sometimes necessary. An orthodontist who says, I just treat all my patients in extraction is probably not a good orthodontist. You can't actually treat everybody by expansion. Occasionally it is necessary to extract teeth. People raise questions about the harm from extractions, but when you actually look at this quite closely and look at the evidence that we have, it certainly appears to me that it's not the extraction of teeth that causes the problem, perhaps in dishing someone's face in. It is more likely to be issues such as poor choice of mechanics and over-retraction. We should generally maintain the arch form. That leads us to the expansionists. We still know, and I know the studies are old and they do have certain flaws, but most clinical wisdom and the studies show us that we should generally maintain arch form and not over-expand everything. We don't know much about relapse. That's a straightforward statement. One of the big mysteries in orthodontics is why some cases relapse and others don't. And if we could get to the answer with that, it will be a major breakthrough for us in perhaps planning our treatment. The most important thing appears to be operator effects that really predict the success or failure of treatment. In fact, it's probably a combination between the operator and the patient effects. It appears to me that all the studies that we look at looking at methods of improving treatment, the most important explanatory variable is probably the operator. So that's really a background to most orthodontic research, but we need to raise certain questions. Are we measuring the right things, and are we missing out on information? So this was some work done by resident student Aliki Shalaki and myself, and this was published in the AAO some time ago. What we really set out to do was look at outcomes that had been used in orthodontic research, and we started this study really by looking at the various definitions, and the clearest definition for oral health is the WHO definition here, which says oral health is a comfortable and functional dentition which allows individuals to continue in their desired social role. So you can see that that's taking into account factors such as oral and dental disease all the way through to psychological factors, and that's very important when we consider orthodontics. So the background to this project really is that the relevance of a study depends on the outcomes that it reports. If we're choosing non-relevant outcomes, then the study's not going to be of much value. And that's quite important because inappropriate outcomes lead to wasted resource. And that's what's been happening, I think, in a lot of orthodontic studies. Because the important thing is if we choose the wrong outcome measure, we could completely miss the effect of an intervention. And that's absolutely crucial to orthodontic research. So we did this study and we started off by asking this simple question, is what outcome measures do we use in orthodontic research? We did a fairly simple method. Aliki systematically reviewed the literature, including randomised trials only from 2008 to 2012. And essentially she recorded and identified the outcome measures that had been used in all these trials. This is a graph of what we found. So the y-axis is the percentage of papers that reported any of the outcomes that are on the x-axis. And we can divide these up into disease activity, cost, adverse effects such as caries and periodontal disease, quality of life factors, self-esteem, psychological status, function, the way that someone could masticate their food, and the consequences of treatment. We'll move back now to look at disease activity in a little more detail. Disease activity includes things such as cephalometric measures and occlusal index measures, amount of expansion, the amount of problems that are associated with malocclusion. We had to take this step because malocclusion itself isn't a disease, it's a variation from a norm, and we measure that with many outcome measures such as cephalometrics. So what did we find at the end of this study? We found that most of the papers, that really is just up to 70%, measured disease activity. As I said, these were cephalometric measures or occlusal index measurements. Just under 30% of the studies evaluated the cost of treatment and the cost to the patient, which was quite interesting. I didn't expect there'd be so many. Again, a similar number measured the adverse effects of treatment, decalcification, root resorption, etc. Much fewer reviewed the quality of life, and that actually is quite important when we consider that we're carrying out a treatment which is supposed to improve someone's appearance. A similar amount looked at the function, and then a final very few looked at the consequences of treatment. That really is did the treatment benefit the patient? So we can see here that we've got quite a range of outcomes, but most of them are in this disease activity section, which are values that are relevant to orthodontics. So the main conclusion from that paper was that we're mostly measuring orthodontist values. And by doing that, by concentrating on the things that mattered to us, like cephalometrics, we're missing information. And if we're missing information, we're wasting time and resource because we're actually not evaluating methods that might be important to our patients, and we're missing the effects of that treatment. So what's the answer to that? Well, one answer is to consider looking at a core outcome set. These are core outcomes that should be evaluated in every trial that's carried out in the future. This is a movement really that started in Europe and is now spreading, called the COMET Initiative, and they've suggested that we have standardised outcomes to be reported in a trial. So we followed COMET methodology in a later paper, of course with a much larger team, looking at this concept of a core outcome set. And the main objective was straightforward, though a rather complex exercise, was to develop a core outcome set for orthodontic trials. So, what did we do? The first stage was to identify all the previous outcomes that had been measured, list all these out in a very uniform format. We then held qualitative interviews with patients and asked them in these interviews what outcomes mattered to them as consumers of care. Then everything was put together in a Delphi consensus, which was done worldwide on the internet, and we asked orthodontists to rank the outcomes that we identified in terms of overall importance to them. And we went through several rounds of this Delphi consensus so that we had a ranked order of outcomes. And then there was a final meeting between a sample of orthodontists and patients to come up with what were the 5 or 6 most important outcomes, and this would form the core outcome set. So what did we find? Well, we found that these were the core outcomes that should be recorded in all orthodontic trials. So these were the number of breakages of appliances. This mattered a lot to our patients. It matters to us as operators. And you can consider this in a real world of a trial. If you've got 2 interventions, one that have no difference in overall outcomes between each of them, but one breaks a lot and another breaks very rarely, then you're going to go for, in terms of evidence, the appliances that don't break so often. There's adverse effects such as caries, root resorption. Skeletal relationship did come in, and it was still important to people to improve the skeletal pattern. Whether that's achievable, we don't know, but nevertheless it's still an outcome that's worth measuring. There's the final occlusion. The patients really expressed this as the straightness of their teeth. They wanted us to record how straight teeth were, for example, at the end of treatment. The great holy grail of stability was very important. And again, it does lead us to that overall conclusion that if we have competing treatments and one is more stable than the other, then obviously that is a superior treatment. Now that's a very difficult thing to measure in long term, but certainly it's something that we should be aiming to do within our studies. There's cooperation, how well the patients cooperated with treatment. Again, you get different variations of compliance between treatment. And then finally was that overall impact of self-perceived aesthetics. That is self-esteem, social psychological status, quality of life. It's absolutely vital now that in orthodontic trials we measure these outcomes. So this sort of gives us that orthodontic nirvana, doesn't it, of wanting to carry out trials that provide us with high levels of evidence, using core outcome sets that reflect patients' and orthodontist values. And it will help us reduce uncertainty, because we have to remember that uncertainty pervades in everything that we do. Research reduces that uncertainty, and we can improve the research with trials and core outcome sets. So really, in this first part of this lecture, I've really set out the case for increasing the quality of orthodontic randomised trials in order to help us reduce uncertainty. In the next part of this lecture, I'm going to look at things that perhaps increase our uncertainty, such as the orthodontic fringe and key opinion leaders. This talk will follow quite soon.